Hi and welcome to our first HReSource webinar, and I'm very pleased to say that you'll see on screen the wonderful Cyber Claire Davey, who's going to be talking to us today about next year. And one thing's for sure, we're certainly hoping it's going to be a better year than this year, but there are things happening in the world of cyber which we need to be aware of. Those of you that tuned into the podcast that Claire very helpfully provided for us earlier in the year will know that she's an award-winning cyber risk specialist. She helps her global clients understand, mitigate and transfer their cyber and contractual technology risk. She is an ACII and CISSP, and if you want to know what that means, it's Certified Information Systems Security Professional. One highly impressive individual who's going to give us a wonderful talk and walk through things happening with cyber for 2021. Over to you, Claire.
Great, thanks very much. Great, thanks very much, David. So today we're going to be looking at the holistic cyber trends for 2021, both in terms of tools, but also the attack vectors as well. So looking at how cyber attacks are likely to play out, and also any potential insurance claims that come off. But we're also going to be looking at some strategies and tips that you can embed within your practice, both professionally and personally, in the next year to make sure that you are the most cyber secure version of yourself that you could be. So moving on to the first slide would be good. Great. So this, first of all, I wanted to talk us through what I would anticipate the cyber trends being for 2021. This is across the threat landscape, more holistically, and I think, we're coming at this from the backdrop that we have been largely working from home due to the COVID-19 global pandemic, and that has caused quite a shift in the way that we conduct business and perform our roles, but also the technology that we need to use on a daily basis. So the first trend that I've identified for 2021 is actually an increase in investment in location agnostic infrastructure. So that means that whether that's a network or actual devices that can be used anywhere in the world to perform the same services to connect to sort of a unified network. I think many people who didn't already have their own sort of corporate devices, portable devices, will have those going into 2021, thinking about sort of laptops, but also iPads, thinking about also the telephone phones as well. But I think we'll also see a shift and an increase in pace of companies migrating their infrastructure or their data towards cloud solutions. This was already starting to happen, but I think the pandemic has highlighted sort of the benefits of having an approach that can be accessed anywhere in the world at any time. I think the second trend that we're likely to see is a focus on endpoint management. So endpoints are nodes that can also be called devices. So when you think about your laptops, your phones, they are endpoints. Because of the nature of the fact that we are remote working and we're having to connect into corporate networks, but through our own private home Wi-Fi's, I think organizations are seeing that as, a high risk area. Individual employees working from home are still the weakest link in terms of a malicious actor trying to access a larger corporate environment. key to the remote working is actually multi-factor authentication, which we'll come on to talk about later, but that will ensure a greater security around those endpoints. And I think a lot more organizations will move towards multi-factor in 2021. I think another issue which will play out in 2021 is the fact that organizations don't necessarily know where all of their endpoints are at the moment. When the pandemic started, we had individuals going into their workplace, unplugging their desktop and towers, strapping them to an office chair with some duct tape around it and wheeling it out of the office because they didn't have a laptop. Now, organizations would usually have an asset inventory, knowing where each device is. And I think it will come to light that actually they don't know anymore where all of their devices are. And that does lead to security concerns. So I think in 2021, we'll see a sort of backfilling of those risk registers to try and understand where everything is and how they can mitigate that risk. The third cyber trend that I can foresee for 2021 is a step change in cybersecurity culture. I think generally the working population was doing quite well at cybersecurity culture and greater awareness. But in 2020, I think that took a bit of a nosedive where everybody started to work from home, because naturally, when you are in your comfortable home environment, you are going to be less mindful that malicious actors are targeting you. Whereas in the corporate environment, there's a lot more oversight. And also policies are geared towards the knowledge that employees are near to a confidential waste bin, and that's not the case at home. So I think there's going to be a sort of revision of policies and procedures around employee cybersecurity culture, almost playing catch up, I guess. Now, convergence of security tools is a big one for 2021. Largely budget driven, but there's some other reasons which we'll come on to later. Year on year, over the past few years, we've seen sort of budget increases of about 10% for IT security teams, so really good growth. But this may be the first year where we see a reduction in that increase, or a reduction altogether. And that will largely be driven by the financial successes or losses of those individual firms. And I think also the general sort of like recession climate, how that comes to be in 2021. So IT security and procurement are already starting to work together, and will continue that throughout 2021 to consolidate contracts with tools that they already have. This will be a cost-saving exercise, but often cybersecurity tools, they can do multiple, they have dual purpose, multi-purposes. It's just that we may not utilize them in all of their capability. And so firms will be looking at how can they utilize the most out of one tool and perhaps retire and stop paying for the other tools. If there are, the cybersecurity organizations out there who develop these tools and sell these tools, I think we'll find a challenging year ahead in terms of sales. I don't think this would be a cyber presentation without talking about cryptocurrencies. I think crypto is continually volatile and will be throughout 2021. It's had more established links with established cyber criminal gangs, particularly through the pandemic with the rise of ransomware, and it's come to government attention. They're already trying to put greater controls around it. I think we potentially might see some governments making a move next year with legislation to ban it outright. But I think in order for that to be successful, due to the nature of what it is, multiple governments would have to collaborate on that. And with political change in sort of the US, UK, or political turbulence in the UK and Europe, particularly with Brexit, you know, it will be interesting to see whether enough momentum could build around that in order to make it happen. The next item on the list, and it may sound quite obvious, but I think there's going to be substantially more consumer and financial data floating online. We've already seen that due to the pandemic, online shopping has increased, and I think high street stores will increasingly close over 2021 because they're no longer viable. And we've seen that this week with the Arcadia group going into administration and others in the week prior. This also means that more entrepreneurs or sort of smaller businesses are also seeing that an online sales model is probably more preferable, bearing in mind we may have multiple lockdowns to come. This means that you've got a lot of businesses engaging in online sales, taking financial information from people who may not, you know, they're not necessarily experienced in cybersecurity, not necessarily using the best tools. And at the moment, financial data, credit card information is incredibly valuable, is actually worth more than the average cost of potentially, you know, selling cocaine on the average high street. So I think we will see a surge in privacy breaches and the fallout from that due to just the nature of numbers there, really. Number 7 on the list is about cyber insurance, and that was originally my background. So I think a lot of large organizations were already purchasing cyber insurance to just mitigate and transfer that risk off their balance sheet. And year on year, they had increased their limits of insurance because it made financial sense to do so. We're now moving into a situation where there's a potential recession coming up in 2021. So not all of those organizations have been successful financially. We're also seeing a hardening of that cyber market, so prices are going up. So for those existing buyers, I think we'll see a stabilization of cyber insurance purchase. There was a flurry of new buyers that came to the market in the midst of COVID, sort of panic buying, I guess you could call it. But I think over the course of the next year, we'll see that drop off. I think there will be a reduction in first-time cyber insurance purchases from some organizations because the price implications of the hard insurance market mean that from a internal budget sign-off perspective, it's become more challenging. And we've already talked about how IT security budgets could potentially reduce, and depending upon which pot that spend comes out of, that could also lead to this reduction of purchases. Lastly, I wanted to highlight the fact that there's likely to be an increase in turnover of cybersecurity staff, first and foremost. And this is already a segment that experiences high turnover because there's a shortage of those individuals with those skill sets, and they can gain obviously higher salaries the more that they move around. I think working from home reduces the barriers, the geographical barriers to entry, and potentially also the time zone barriers to entry for cybersecurity staff. It means that they could go for jobs that they wouldn't previously have done before, and can make them more attractive to potential employers. Then on the flip side, we have just general employee turnover from furloughs, redundancies, sort of terminating contracts, that sort of thing. And I think we'll see an increase in that throughout 2021, again, as the financial implications of the pandemic unravel. But in both of those instances, both cybersecurity employees and employees generally, there is an increased cyber risk with turnover because you have to revoke those access rights. They could perhaps be disgruntled employees that are leaving with perhaps bad intentions. And so we may see the fallout of that churn, whether it's through privacy breaches or intentional sort of computer outages caused by rogue employees. So that covers it off for the overall cyber trends for the year. If we move on to the next slide, we'll see that we're going to dig down into what this means in terms of cybersecurity tools and measures that can be implemented throughout organizations in 2021. We talked about the fact that there will be an increased migration to the cloud. Organizations are potentially engaging multiple cloud providers to create a solution so they're not dependent upon one versus the other. But I think from 2018 to 2020, there was something like 30 billion records already breached as a result of poor cloud security configuration. They were misconfigured. So that means that they had all the gear but no idea, and that can lead to significant problems because you may either have been relying on the cloud service provider to do those security controls, or there's another model where you can do it yourself. But either way, it has to be configured correctly. The cloud security posture management tools will be able to provide organizations with oversight as to what's within their cloud across multiple providers, and create a layer of security that's perhaps in addition to whatever that cloud service provider is also offering. But it's not just about security, it's also about awareness of what's in the cloud, so helping organizations do a data inventory, which is particularly relevant with GDPR and preventing data from crossing the Atlantic between the US and Europe. It also can provide more insight or oversight of functionality and performance levels. So if we're all trying to access the cloud in one go, if you're sharing certain elements of the cloud with other organizations, you may find that there's dips in performance. So these sort of posture management tools will help to even that out and provide more intelligence as to how it's being used and how it could be more efficiently used. The second tool or sort of framework that I wanted to highlight as something for 2021 was a zero trust philosophy. And there are tools which are based on zero trust that you could find out there, but zero trust in a way is an approach. So it doesn't take it for granted that you are who you say you are when you try and log into a system. And this can be a combination of identity access management tools. It could also be firewalls as well, sort of really pulling together to ensure that nobody breaches the perimeter and gets access to things that they shouldn't. But whilst using zero trust based tools, it has to be managed and implemented with a governance framework that's also based on zero trust. Okay, so it's a sort of yin and yang scenario, which I think within 2021 we'll see organizations increasingly move towards that model. We'll see old VPNs being retired that don't operate on a zero trust basis. Definitely the way forward, especially with remote working, because you just don't know who is at the end of that endpoint when they're not in the office. So the third one is multi-factor authentication. And I talk about this quite a lot because it's one of my favorite tools, I think, to validate identity access. And companies are increasingly implementing this, not only this year, but also into next year. You'll definitely recognize this from your own lives, where you have internet banking, for instance, that requires your code or multiple codes as well as your thumbprint. So multi-factor authentication is essentially where you require a number of methods to validate who you say you are. So it's often something something you have, and something you are. So have would be a password. Have would be something physical, perhaps like a security card. Something you know is a password. And then something you are can be your thumbprint or a retina scan, so often biometric data. With the increased focus on endpoint security that we talked about earlier as sort of a holistic trend, multi-factor authentication definitely plays a key part in that security. So next is around behavioral analytics, and again, there have been tools out there that have existed prior to 2021. I'm not naming particular brands because I don't think this is the place to do that. But I think largely we have policed behavior in the past by the fact that everybody is sitting around you in the office. And so organizations presume that you're not going to get up to no good because you've got your colleagues there to kind of shoulder surf whatever you're doing. Behavioral analytics tools will roll out across organizations and your remote technology to analyze the behavior of users on their devices. So looking at sort of like keystrokes, potentially, and it could also be, monitoring you through your camera or looking at your email, scanning your emails to see who you're sending them to, what websites are you going on. One of my old clients told me that they always knew who was going to leave the organization because with the 6 months prior to them resigning, their internet surfing would always spike, so hugely increase, where they had become less engaged. And so if we can make those analyses ahead of time and predict when employees are going to leave the firm, it definitely helps us manage behavior and prevents things like rogue employee situations. The next on the list is next generation firewalls. This will be the third generation. Again, next gen firewalls are not a new concept, but tied into the idea of sort of contractual streaming and consolidating of contracts for security tools. Organizations are going to increasingly use next gen firewalls because they incorporate a number of tools. If you think about intrusion detection, intrusion protection, identity access management, data leakage protection. So all of those concepts where organizations would have bought separate tools potentially to do those jobs, next gen firewalls are saying, hey, we can do all of that within one. So as organizations look to consolidate how much they're spending on these tools and what they're going to invest in, I think next gen firewalls will be fairly high on that list. Containerization and micro virtualization definitely sounds more complicated than it needs to be. But we already have some of this technology when we think about bringing your own device to work or using your own device to access work environments. Sometimes it's with secure apps like Mobile Iron. And so you have to log into that app in order to access that sort of contained secure network that's just one feature within your actual device. Again, when we think about the overall trend of focusing on point protection. Containerization is one of those things. It means that if somebody gets sent a link or a PDF document, they can view that link or that document within a sort of secure hub that remains on that device, rather than then traveling back to the mothership and the larger network and infecting that. And if employees are the weakest, remote working employees are the weakest link into larger organizations, that's definitely something to be focusing on. Just to add there, I think I was reading a survey by CyberEdge yesterday, and they were of the opinion that 40% of large organizations globally are going to be moving towards containerization. So that's quite a big statistic. Obviously there'll be a percentage that already adopt it, but I think that's quite a large trend at a 40% sort of uptake over the next 12 months. I wanted to move on to advanced security analytics, and this also feeds into the trend of employee turnover, particularly that of cybersecurity turnover. So when we have all of these tools, they do provide outputs. They provide lots of big reports as to what's a risk, what's being flagged as red, what's an emergency. And ultimately, if we have less cybersecurity employees due to furlough, or due to the fact that there's high turnover of employees, those that are existing are really going to rely on and require advanced security analytics. So this is essentially technology that will try and predict what is a normal trend versus an abnormal trend, and therefore flag alerts on that basis to basically stop the number of false positives and reduce the amount of eyes and hours that are required to look at these reports. It basically will make IT departments more efficient, and if their budgets are being cut, this may be an area that they really focus on. Lastly, I wanted to just touch upon business continuity plans, and they're not a technical tool in the way that sort of we've been talking about these other things, but they should be used as a tool to support the business. And I think we've seen with coronavirus how many organizations didn't have a continuity plan or hadn't practiced their continuity plan, or even that their BCP was very much focused around place rather than people. And so I think 2021, now that sort of things have stabilized, the BCP teams will be sort of like re-engaged to give a refresh to those plans, to test them, to have them signed off and re-released. So I think we're going to see, hopefully some more sort of testing and engagement around that. I think it's likely that sort of companies that assist in those testings and also consult on them, like for instance Deloitte and so on, they will see an increase in engagement from organizations on that service. Moving on to the next slide. I wanted to translate all of sort of what we've just been talking about in terms of predicted cyber attacks and claims trends for the next year. This is going to be hugely informed by COVID-19, as the investment in tools have been and the trends across the landscape. So you'll see how this all ties together. But first of all, I think there will be an emergence of COVID-19 healthcare and vaccine related attacks. During the pandemic, we've already seen hospitals struggling under ransomware attacks, whilst they've got patients strapped into the ICU and very much at risk. I think we will potentially see, or tied to ransomware, which will come on later, I think we will actually see a cost to human life as a result of ransomware due to the prevalence of the attacks on the healthcare industry. But we saw yesterday that IBM came out to the press to talk about how the logistical firms supporting the transportation of the vaccine into the UK had been targeted by multiple cyber attacks, to whether that's to disrupt the actual vaccine itself, or to gain information about what the vaccine is, and from a competitive advantage perspective. I'm not 100% sure at this time, but moving on to 2021, I think the vaccine offers malicious actors such a platform in terms of creating publicity, demonstrating what they can do in terms of damage, causing huge disruption. And there's also the political motivations, because it became almost a race to produce the vaccine across multiple jurisdictions. And so I think we need to be mindful that it's not just going to be sort of cyber criminal gangs targeting vaccine related infrastructure. It's also going to be potentially nation states. So ransomware, definitely feeds onto that. We had a case throughout 2020, we saw about a 200% increase in ransomware attacks. And I think that will no doubt continue throughout 2020. Throughout 2021. They have got more sophisticated. There's almost become sort of a democratization of ransomware, where anybody can sort of go online and order some ransomware to be sent to somebody. Employees working from home are sort of the lowest hanging fruit in that sense, but we would predict that over the next year, ransomware is going to spread sort of and be targeting outside of those the main industries. So it's not just going to be about healthcare, financial institutions, and education. It will be broader than that. I think that ransomware, whilst large organisations did get caught up in sort of the big attacks of 2017 with NotPetya, ransomware is something which is just it's something that's so prevalent just for self-employed, small business owners, and can cause huge disruption. So just something to bear in mind going forward. I've also put up there that I expect to see a reduction in the success of phishing emails with multi-factor authentication. There's mixed debates about that. I think multi-factor authentication will mean that even if somebody does send you a phishing email and you click on the link and you give them some of your details, they still can't get into the system because they don't have the token that's sent to your phone. Having said that, I think that they will find ways around it to then convince you that there's a next stage, that you need to give this other code. They are great at manipulation and socially engineering people, as we'll come on to later. So I think we may see an initial dip and then a rise again as the malicious actors sort of catch up with the technology that organizations have put into place. We will also see, and already see, tailored phishing emails very much to current news stories, in the moment news stories, for instance, about the Prime Minister's latest press briefing, particularly around HMRC and sort of tax rebates, furlough schemes, all those sorts of things which are very important to people at the moment, and actually affecting a large portion of the population. That if you think, if you are one of those people who sends the phishing links, your attrition rate, or your sort of success rate, I guess, is going to be quite high, just because of the nature of the fact that so many people are talking to HMRC or accessing sort of government bodies quite regularly at the moment due to the COVID pandemic. Another sort of attack vector I've put down is cloud jacking. It's kind of another form of the attacks that we've talked about before, but with the use of the cloud, I think, and the prevalence of what data is going to be in the cloud, we're going to see malicious actors increasingly targeting for access via employees' credentials to get into the cloud, and then that's essentially a big honeypot of information. So again, thinking back to those tools that we were talking about, really that sort of like cloud service, the cloud service management tools are really going to be key with that, along with zero trust. So trying to implement those two things to reduce the likelihood that your cloud provider is going to be a target of attack. And we've seen, last year that Capital One was a big victim, accessed via Amazon Web Services and a rogue employee. So definitely, cloud is not immune, despite the fact that some of the organizations providing the cloud infrastructure are huge beasts and will often accept very little liability in terms of their own contracts. So I wanted to think a bit about social engineering, and sometimes there's a confusion between social engineering and phishing emails, but they're not wholly separate, in the sense that often social engineering is used to make a phishing email more likely or more plausible. But here in the sort of item number 5, what I want to be thinking about is the likelihood that employees will receive a fake invoice or a doctored or manipulated invoice for emergency quick payment. And because they're sat at home, they're no longer around those individuals who would provide that chain of command and that escalation point. I think we'll see an increased theft of funds where employees, particularly in finance, are targeted and therefore make these payments when the payment destination is not legitimate. So they know that they were due to receive an invoice from the waste collection specialists, but what they didn't check was the bank account details that it's to, or the fact that the value of it has breached their own authority threshold. So it's those sorts of things that really are worth bearing in mind, because it's essentially just, like handing money over to cyber criminals, when again a multi-factored authentication approach could be used. We could ring up the individual, we could email them, we could check the numbers of the accounts versus what we paid last time, and so on. It's really operating on that zero trust basis. Number 6 sort of ties into that employee turnover theme that we were talking about earlier. It's sort of the rise of an insider threat as a service, which is quite galling to think about. But the concept of the rogue employee actually is that rogue employee turns professional in sort of selling out their access services to the dark web and malicious people, because they can gain access to certain data. And so particularly if they're disgruntled due to the pandemic situation, but also as we see normal people struggling in the recession context of potentially next year, we may see that more insiders, more employees see that data leakage, or even IP selling is almost a viable alternative. Number 7 is around potential privacy claims by employees. This is definitely something which, often we see as a trend first come out of the US due to their litigious environment, and then it gets replicated in the UK. But due to the fact that privacy policies are probably likely to change, again, we talked about behavioral analytics. Companies are going to try and monitor employees' usage of their devices, but these employees are going to be at home and they're potentially their own devices. And so if bring your own device policies, privacy policies haven't been updated by employers to reflect the fact that they are going to be conducting surveillance of their employees, that really opens them up to potential privacy claims. Another factor here is that often the privacy policy is between the employee and the employer. But in a situation where you're working from home and you've got your children in the background, or you've got, your broader family, that could lead to sort of allegations of infringement of privacy, because it's not just about you as the employee in that contractual relationship. The employer has then surveilled your family and potentially minors. So that's something that we also need to bear in mind. Lastly, I just wanted to flag up here as a sort of personal note for some people. I think we will likely see individuals' home networks targeted by malicious actors, because again, if it is thought that they are the weakest link into a larger organization, particularly if that individual is high up in that organization or is in a particularly high access administrative role where they could access number of systems, I think they're going to be increasingly targeted. So sort of the takeaway, I guess, from that would have been that really think about, it's not just your corporate security that we should be mindful of, but your personal network, and obviously everybody who feeds into that network, because a malicious actor may try to access you and your employer through that, but then do they have access to your children and so on and so forth? So it really does become pervasive. But lastly, I wanted to end on a positive note and actually give you something to think about, more to think about, but to take away and to potentially, bring into action yourselves within your own professional or personal lives. And so this is your opportunity in 2021 to be for a new year and a new cyber secure you. I've offered up a few approaches here. There's like the physical tools, technical tools, administrative and financial tools to address cyber risk. So it really should be an holistic approach, bringing together all facets of those. So from a physical standpoint, one of the simplest things that we can do is to shred any paper that we print. We're so used to being in the office where we have confidential waste bins or shredders right there. Now we're printing off documents potentially to be signed or scanned back in, or just to read. They sit on our desks. Who's coming into our office and at home? Thinking about, have our children walked off with the paper to draw on? And then where does that piece of paper end up? So really creating like a secure compound around the paper that you're printing off, and then as soon as you're finished with it, it goes into shredder. I think I might have mentioned this on the podcast that I did with David back in sort of the first lockdown, was that we have seen sort of high-end neighbourhoods and their rubbish bins being ransacked by criminals who are after such confidential documents, whether that's corporate intellectual property or data pertaining to the organization. And they think that high sort of value neighborhoods, they would have sort of the management or exec level living there, getting access to a lot more of the documentation. So I think really bear in mind what you're throwing into your normal black bin. Another physical control, and I know it's easier said than done when we're working with multiple people in the same house, but is a separate workspace. And that doesn't necessarily mean that 100% of the time you have to be quarantined into your own room, but it's thinking about what call am I on right now, and who else is on another video streaming call that's actually picking up my call on their call, and therefore creating data leakage. Who is, in a sense, then exposed to the conversations that I'm having? And we would think about this perhaps when we were traveling on a train or an aeroplane. We would be mindful of what we're talking about in that confined space. But ultimately, when we're all working from home in some shape or form, it's highly likely that we're going to get sort of a bleed of information spanning across our different communication methods. So really, when you are having those confidential client calls, operate on the basis of zero trust and go into your own room. Sometimes, unfortunately, that may even be the bathroom, but just to make sure that your conversation isn't being picked up and broadcast elsewhere. Some technical controls for you. I mean, I've talked about it numerous times on this webinar, but multi-factor authentication, it doesn't have to be as complicated as your retinal scanner. We talked a bit previously on the slide before about social engineering and invoices. As a self-employed person or a small business, you are likely to be sending out your own invoices and seeking payment. It takes no time at all to say at the bottom of the email, please can you give me a call before you remit payment to double check the account details. So simple checks and balances that you can put into place around those, particularly around invoices. If you are sending and receiving those, that's a good starting point. If you're part of a broader organization and you do have a VPN, I would say, make an effort to stay within the VPN. Even if at lunchtime you want to surf the websites, stay within the VPN. There's so much malicious content that could access your endpoint through not being in the VPN, because it means you're outside of the controls, the security controls that your organization has implemented. A lot of people at the beginning of the pandemic were told to come off the VPN when you're trying to operate on Zoom because it slows the bandwidth. And I understand that, but the solution is to increase the bandwidth through your providers to leverage those contracts. Don't reduce the security controls to meet the tools that you're using. Administrative controls that I'd identify is engage in learning. Webinars like this, reading up, thinking about how the current environment is shaping the cyber threats that we're facing, I think, will help us to remain vigilant, and particularly now that we're not in that corporate environment where everybody's in a suit and everybody looks like they are managing risk. I think we need to make more of an effort to create that cyber aware culture, but just within our own bubbles at home. Something I've put down there is, as an administrative control is to map your data. And that sounds very technical. What it means is essentially create a list of where your data is. Even from a personal perspective, you can do this, but you can also do it as an employee with, multiple devices. Is where is your data sitting? Have you copied documents off and then left them on your desktop rather than within the security of the cloud that is the preferential approach? Thinking about, how much personal, financial, health data that you have really can help you then think about what's your exposure to a cyber attack and the likely cost that would arise out of a cyber attack. If you're, a self-employed practitioner, for instance, an osteopath, you're going to have patient data, but just because you're not a massive US healthcare company doesn't mean that you don't have any exposure. So really thinking about where does your patient data reside in comparison to your normal learning and development portfolio or your emails, for instance. Lastly, financially, I wanted to provide a couple of suggestions, and one is to transfer your risk. And now that I'm no longer a broker, I'm not trying to sell insurance. That is not my job. But I would say that once you've mapped your data and you know the likely cost, you can then decide and make a more informed decision as to whether it makes sense, whether to transfer your risk into the insurance market and buy a cyber insurance policy. You know, much like we would buy a property policy just in case our building burns down, even though we have fire alarms and potentially fire extinguishers, we still take the belts and braces approach. And I would argue that it is sensible to do the same from a cyber perspective. But even if you don't do that, and perhaps, you know, I should have put this first because it is one of the steps you can go through to understand what's your maximum probable loss, but is to review your contractual provisions with people. Organizations are obviously contracting with huge amounts of people, and, you know, even tech companies to offload their data onto a software as a service. You know, what's the contractual liability there if there is a problem with if there is a data breach? But also as a smaller business or a self-employed person, you know, how much money are you signing away in the event that you have a cyber incident? So really think about that, and that should inform also whether you choose to then move forward into transferring the risk. So I hope that's a number of things to think about for how you can up your game in terms of cybersecurity in 2021. It's given you a good view across both the holistic trends, but then how that feeds down into the individual attack vectors and the tools that can help prevent those attacks from taking place. So those are my details currently on the screen. So if you've got any follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out, connect with me on LinkedIn or Twitter, and you can stay updated with all of the sort of content that I put out around sort of latest trends. So thank you very much.
Well, I think I managed to unmute myself. I'm back in the room. Thank you very much, Claire. That was unbelievable. A great deal of excellent content. And I think for most of us that are actually watching that now are thinking, I've got some work to do. And obviously people that have heard about stories of people who are monitoring their staff and perhaps overstepping the mark. There's some very big examples of people who've actually been doing that, and they are people like Google. They've got a case on at the moment. I mean, that's quite stunning. Also, I did something that struck me as I was listening to your talk, and it was we've also got another big date commit, which is Brexit. And a lot of there's talk about data issues around that. That's a whole different webinar, I'm sure. But what I would say is thank you from the bottom of my heart for such a fantastic presentation. If anybody needs to speak to Claire, contact Claire. It's cyberclaire.com is where you can find her. Also within our community network. And also from my perspective, I think everybody should give you a big round of applause for that. But what I would like to say is we've got 3 polls that are built into this presentation, which I understand the technology will allow you to take part in that if you're watching the recording. Ask us a question, pop something in the feed there, and I'm sure Claire will be more than happy to answer those for you.
Great, thanks very much, David. It's been a pleasure to be on with got a bit of feedback there. Sorry. Yeah, it's been a great pleasure to be on with the HReSource network. So thanks again. I know that you. So we did this with the podcast the first time around, and tried to up our game with technology this time. So
we're trying.
It's a result.
We're trying. Thank you very much, Claire. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye.
Take care.